Welcome to Family Betrayal Revenge. Stay tuned. Have a fun time and let's talk in the comment. Let's go!
My parents stole my 10-year-old daughter Emma's rare first edition book collection, the one she inherited from my great-grandmother, and sold it for $265,000 to build a home theater for my sister's kids. When great-grandmother Helen found out, she smiled and said, "The estate was never theirs anyway." If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I didn't scream when I found out what they'd done, didn't throw anything, didn't demand answers in a voice that shook the walls. That would have required an emotional investment I no longer possessed in the people who happened to share my DNA, the people who'd spent 34 years teaching me that being the responsible daughter meant being the invisible one. The one who fixed problems without complaint, the one who made their lives easier while mine got harder. So when I discovered they'd sold my daughter's inheritance, her future, her connection to a woman who'd loved her more purely than they ever could, I simply turned around, took Emma's hand in mine, and walked out of that house while the smell of fresh construction dust and expensive paint still clung to my clothes like evidence of their crime. You can smell a lie just as clearly as you can smell a renovation, and that house reeked of both. The chemical tang of the new home theater wing they'd built with Emma's money felt like an indictment, like physical proof of exactly how little we mattered to them. It was the scent of $265,000 of my daughter's future being poured into drywall and surround sound speakers and leather recliners that cost more than some people's cars. And as I sat in my Honda Civic in their circular driveway, engine still warm from the drive over, the vibrations of the seat matching the cold, steady rhythm of my heart, I realized that this moment had been coming for decades. I just hadn't recognized the road I was on until I'd already arrived at the destination. Beside me, Emma was silent. She wasn't crying, wasn't asking questions, wasn't doing any of the things a 10-year-old should do when their world has just been stolen. She was a quiet, observant child, too much like me perhaps, and she'd spent enough summers in that climate-controlled library with great-grandmother Helen, learning that some things are meant to be preserved and some things are meant to be discarded, to know exactly which category she'd just been placed in by her own grandparents. She understood in that moment what it had taken me 34 years to fully grasp, that to my parents we were supporting characters in a story where only my sister Victoria and her children deserved starring roles, and that understanding sat between us in that car like a third passenger, silent and knowing and absolutely certain. I reached into the back seat and pulled out my laptop, the same one I used to manage the estate's historical tax exemption portal, the same one I'd been using for 6 years to save my parents tens of thousands of dollars annually, and I didn't feel like a mother in that moment, didn't feel like a daughter. I felt like an auditor, like someone who'd just discovered a massive discrepancy in the books and was about to file a report that would bring the whole operation crashing down. For years I had been the silent investor in their version of a happy family, the one who managed the paperwork that kept their colonial estate designated as a historical landmark, a designation that saved them $38,000 in property taxes every single year. They saw it as my duty, saw it as what daughters who majored in archival science were supposed to do for their families. I saw it as a subscription fee to a family I was starting to realize I'd never actually been a member of. I didn't need to hack into any systems because I was the authorized liaison for the historical registry. I was the person the state contacted when they needed verification that the Madison estate was maintaining its landmark status, that the historical integrity of the property was being preserved, that the family who lived there understood they were custodians of something larger than themselves. My parents believed the tax break was their birthright, believed it came automatically with owning a house that was 200 years old, but they'd forgotten, or more likely had never bothered to learn, that the exemption was strictly contingent on my annual compliance audit, on my professional certification that they were meeting the preservation requirements. And the moment they gutted that library, the moment they ripped out the climate-controlled shelving and the archival lighting and the humidity monitors to make room for a 75-inch television screen and a popcorn machine, they'd invalidated their exemption. They'd turn their luxury estate back into a regular taxable property, one they could never afford to maintain. I didn't revoke it out of spite. That's important to understand. I wasn't acting out of anger or revenge or any of the hot emotions that make people do things they later regret. I simply filed a formal notice of noncompliance with the state historical registry. A factual document that stated the Madison estate no longer met the criteria for landmark status due to unauthorized structural modifications to a protected space. It was accurate, it was professional, it was the kind of paperwork I filed all the time in my job at the university archives. The only difference was that this time the property in question belonged to my parents, and the financial consequences would be immediate and catastrophic if they wanted to treat family assets like their personal slush fund. If they wanted to liquidate a 10-year-old's inheritance to build an entertainment center, then they could manage the legal complexities of maintaining a historical landmark without my professional oversight. They could pay the full tax burden like everyone else who didn't have a daughter willing to work for free to preserve their comfortable lifestyle. Then I opened my banking app, the screen glowing blue in the dim light of the car while Emma sat beside me drawing patterns in the condensation on her window, not crying, just existing in that terrible calm that children develop when they've been disappointed by adults one too many times. Last month, my mother had suggested, and by suggested, I mean informed me with the kind of cheerful entitlement that made it clear refusal wasn't an option, that I should pay the $14,000 catering deposit for Victoria's theater reveal party. She'd called it my contribution to the children's happiness, by which she meant Victoria's children, the grandchildren who mattered, the ones whose comfort and entertainment justified any expense, any sacrifice, any theft. I had paid it quietly the way I always did, transferring money I'd saved for Emma's college fund. Money I'd earned working overtime shifts at the university to catalog a private collection, thinking that being easy to manage was the same thing as being loved, thinking that if I just gave enough, sacrificed enough, stayed silent enough, they would eventually see my value. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdraft for years, had been an unlimited credit line they'd maxed out without ever intending to pay back, and the account was finally, irrevocably empty. I initiated a stop payment on that $14,000 catering deposit, didn't hesitate, didn't ask myself if Victoria would be embarrassed when the caterers refused to set up, didn't wonder if the party would be ruined, didn't care if my mother would have to scramble to find replacement vendors. This wasn't a breakdown, this was a balance sheet. This was me finally treating our relationship like the financial transaction they'd always treated it as. Debits and credits, contributions and withdrawals. And I was done being the only one making deposits into an account that only they could access. I watched the confirmation screen glow in the darkness. Transaction canceled. Funds returned to account. And the power shift felt cold and clinical and absolutely right. They weren't going to be shocked by what they'd done, weren't going to suddenly develop the moral clarity to understand that stealing from a child was wrong. They were going to be shocked that I had finally stopped playing along, that the daughter who'd spent 34 years being useful had decided that being heard mattered more than being convenient. Inside that house, they were probably already picking out the velvet for the theater seats, debating whether to go with burgundy or navy, discussing whether the seats should have cup holders or heating elements, spending money that had been earmarked for Emma's future on luxuries for children who already had everything, while out here in the dark my laptop glowed with a different kind of illumination, the kind made of facts and numbers, and the quiet, devastating power of someone who'd finally stopped confusing compliance with love. The Madison family had always looked perfect from the outside. We lived in one of those historic neighborhoods where every house had a name instead of just a number, where the lawns were maintained by professional services and the mailboxes were custom designed to match the architectural period. Our house was called Blackwood Manor, a colonial estate that sat on 5 manicured acres with gardens that had been featured in Southern Living magazine twice. The driveway was lined with magnolia trees that were older than the Civil War, and the house itself was the kind of place that made people slow down when they drove past, the kind that got pointed out on historical tours. My father, Richard Madison, owned the largest construction firm in 3 counties, Madison and Sons Development, the kind of company that had built half the commercial real estate downtown and had their logo on billboards along the interstate. Our garage held his Range Rover, my mother's Mercedes, and Victoria's Audi that she'd gotten as a 30th birthday present, a car that cost more than most people's annual salary. My mother, Patricia, played her role with the precision of a trained actress, the devoted wife, the gracious hostess, the woman who knew everyone who mattered and made sure everyone knew she mattered. She used Wedgwood china for Sunday dinners even when it was just family, kept fresh flowers from the farmer's market in every room, wore her smile like expensive jewelry that never came off in public no matter what was happening behind closed doors. She was the woman other women wanted to be: poised, elegant, always saying exactly the right thing at charity luncheons and garden club meetings, always making sure the family image stayed as polished as the silverware she insisted on using for every meal. And Victoria, my younger sister by 4 years, she was the golden child in the most literal sense. Everything she touched seemed to glow with importance. Every milestone she reached got celebrated like a national holiday. Every mistake she made got reframed as a learning experience or blamed on circumstances beyond her control. She'd been groomed since childhood to be the heir to our parents' social status, the one who would marry well and produce beautiful grandchildren and carry on the Madison name with the appropriate level of grace and visibility. Everything Victoria wanted she eventually got, whether it was a semester abroad in Paris, a wedding that cost more than most people's houses, or apparently a home theater built with money stolen from her niece. I had learned early, painfully early, that daughters occupied different positions in the Madison household hierarchy. Victoria was the treasure, the investment, the one worth spending money on because her success reflected well on the family. I was the utility player, the one who handled logistics and solved problems and made things run smoothly, the one who was supposed to be grateful for the privilege of being related to such important people. When Victoria wanted to study art history in Europe, my father wrote a check for $40,000 without blinking. When I asked 2 years later if they could help with my graduate school tuition for archival science, they told me that practical degrees were investments I should make in myself, that taking out loans would teach me financial responsibility, that I needed to learn the value of money by earning it rather than expecting handouts. Have you ever felt like the invisible child in your own family? Like no matter what you accomplished, it would never matter as much as your sibling's smallest achievement? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I want to know I'm not alone in this. At family dinners, and we had them every single Sunday without exception, the conversation orbited around Victoria like she was the sun, and we were all just planets grateful to exist in her gravitational pull. My father would sit at the head of that enormous mahogany table, the one that could seat 14 but usually sat only 6, and he'd hold court like a king dispensing wisdom to his favorite subject. He'd ask Victoria about her social media brand, about her influencer partnerships, about her plans for growing her follower count. He'd offer business advice and connections and suggestions like her Instagram account was a Fortune 500 company deserving of strategic consultation. Meanwhile, I could mention that I'd been promoted to senior archivist at the State University, that I'd been asked to lead a major digitization project, that I'd published an article in a professional journal. And he'd nod absently and ask me to pass the potatoes. I wasn't being ignored exactly. I was being acknowledged in the way you acknowledge background music. Pleasant enough, but not worthy of actual attention. My mother's contribution to these dinners was to make sure Victoria always had the best cut of meat, the crispiest vegetables, the first choice of dessert, and to remind me regularly that I should be more like my sister, more social, more photogenic, more willing to put myself out there and build a public presence. She'd say things like, "Victoria just has that natural charisma, doesn't she?" Or, "I wish you'd make more of an effort with your appearance, Sarah. You have such potential, if you'd just try." The implication was always clear. Victoria was the success story. I was the rough draft that never quite got edited into something publishable, and my role was to accept this hierarchy without complaint because complaining would make me seem jealous or petty or unable to be happy for my sister's achievements. When I was 19, I overheard a conversation that changed how I saw my parents forever. I was home from college for Christmas break, had come downstairs to get a glass of water because I couldn't sleep, and I heard voices coming from my father's study. The door was cracked open just enough for sound to escape. And I stood in the hallway in my pajamas listening to my parents discuss their daughters like we were investments they were evaluating for return potential. "Victoria is going to marry well," my father was saying, his voice carrying that tone of absolute certainty he used when discussing business projections. "She's got the looks, the charm, the social connections. She'll bring prestige to this family. She'll marry someone from the right kind of family, and those connections will be valuable. But Sarah," he paused, and in that pause I heard everything I needed to know about how he saw me. "Sarah is practical. She'll have a stable career. She'll be self-sufficient. We won't have to worry about her. She doesn't need what Victoria needs." I stood frozen in that hallway, my hand still reaching for the doorknob I'd been about to turn, and I understood with perfect clarity that in my father's mind I wasn't a daughter with dreams or potential or value beyond my ability to not be a problem. I was the low-maintenance child, the one who didn't require investment because I'd turn out fine on my own. I was the child they didn't have to worry about, which really meant I was the child they didn't worry about, period. And that realization, that understanding that my independence had been mistaken for not needing love, not deserving attention, not mattering as much, that was the moment something inside me started to calcify, started to harden into the person who could sit in a car 34 years old with a laptop full of documents that would destroy her parents' financial security and feel nothing but cold satisfaction. Because if they taught me anything, it was that family was a transaction, and I was done being the only one who paid the cost. The summer before I started graduate school, my parents did something that seemed generous at the time. They offered to let me manage the estate's historical designation in exchange for what they called a family discount on rent. I was living in a small apartment near campus, working 2 jobs to pay tuition, and the offer seemed like relief, like finally being seen as valuable. My mother explained that since I was studying archival science anyway, it made sense for me to handle the paperwork that kept Blackwood Manor classified as a historical landmark. She made it sound like I'd be doing myself a favor, getting real-world experience while helping the family. My father added that they'd reduce my rent by half, from $800 a month to $400, in exchange for my expertise, and I'd accepted gratefully, desperately, pathetically grateful that they were acknowledging my skills even if they were only willing to pay me in discounted rent rather than actual money. What I didn't understand then, what took me years to piece together, was that the historical designation I was maintaining saved them $38,000 annually in property taxes. They were paying me $4,800 a year in rent reduction to manage an exemption worth 8 times that amount. They'd found a way to get professional archival services at a 90% discount by wrapping exploitation in the language of family helping family, and I'd been too eager for their approval, too desperate to feel useful, too well trained in the art of being grateful for scraps to see that I was being used. I managed that designation for 6 years, filed the annual compliance reports, maintained the documentation, liaised with the state historical registry, did work that would have cost them $15,000 a year if they'd hired an actual firm, and they paid me in rent reductions that totaled less than $5,000 annually. The math was devastating when I finally let myself see it clearly. I thought about all of this as I sat in my car watching the windows of Blackwood Manor glow with warm, expensive light. Thought about the years I'd spent being useful while Victoria was being celebrated. Thought about how my parents had built their entire lifestyle on a foundation of my unpaid labor, and called it love, called it family obligation, called it me being the responsible one. And I realized that my silence over the years hadn't been weakness. It had been a survival mechanism. A psychological adaptation I developed to exist in an environment where love was a limited resource and making yourself small was the only way to guarantee you'd get any at all. I'd learned young that if I didn't ask for anything, didn't complain, didn't make waves, if I fixed every problem before it became an inconvenience for the people in charge, I might get to stay, might get to be part of the family even if I was never going to be the favorite. But that survival mechanism had become a prison. Invisible chains that kept me compliant even when compliance was destroying me. I'd spent 34 years believing that if I was just useful enough, just quiet enough, just helpful enough, they would eventually see my value, would eventually love me the way they loved Victoria, effortlessly, publicly, without me having to earn it with endless service. But the truth, the cold, hard truth I was finally letting myself acknowledge, was that being easy to manage just makes you easier to overlook. It makes you the child they don't worry about, which really means the child they don't think about, the child they can steal from without guilt because surely she'll understand, surely she'll forgive, surely she knows this is just how families work. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror, a 34-year-old woman wearing a sweater I'd bought at a consignment shop 3 years ago because spending money on myself felt selfish when Emma needed new shoes, when the car needed repairs, when there was always something more important than my comfort. I'd been directing my income toward Emma's education and great-grandmother Helen's care, paying for the specialized dementia facility where Helen lived with dignity, paying for Emma's Piano lessons and art supplies and the small luxuries that made childhood feel magical, while Victoria's designer wardrobe was funded by family loans that were never called loans but gifts. Money my parents handed over without expecting repayment because Victoria's happiness was an investment worth making. I was the invisible engine driving their lifestyle, a ghost employee keeping their financial house from collapsing while they basked in the appearance of wealth and status and success. I had saved them $38,000 a year for 6 years through my management of the estate's historical designation. That was $228,000 in tax savings that they'd enjoyed while paying me a fraction of what my work was worth. Yet when Emma's 10th birthday approached, and she'd asked so hopefully if Grandma and Grandpa might help buy her a new bookshelf for the rare editions great-grandmother Helen had been giving her, my mother had laughed. Actually laughed, and said that children don't need expensive furniture. They need to learn to take care of what they have. But those same grandparents had no problem spending $265,000 of Emma's inheritance on a home theater for Victoria's children. The math wasn't just unfair. It was obscene. It was a monument to exactly how little we mattered in their calculations. I remembered Emma in that library just 2 weeks ago, the last time we'd visited before my parents gutted it to make room for their construction project. The room had been her sanctuary since she was 5 years old. A place that smelled like lemon furniture polish and old leather and the peppermint tea that great-grandmother Helen always kept in a porcelain pot on the reading table. Emma would sit cross-legged on the oriental rug with Helen beside her in the wingback chair, and Helen would take down books that were 200 years old, 300 years old, first editions and signed copies and volumes so rare they appeared in auction. Catalogs with 5-figure estimates, and she'd let Emma hold them with her small, careful hands, would teach her how to turn pages without damaging the spine, how to recognize a first edition by the publisher's marks, how to understand that these books weren't just objects. They were voices from the past that we were privileged to protect. Helen would tell Emma stories about how she'd acquired each volume, the estate sale where she'd found a signed Mark Twain for $20 because the seller didn't know what they had, the auction where she'd outbid a museum for a first edition Whitman, the bookshop in London where she discovered a complete set of Dickens that had been published during his lifetime, and Emma would listen with the kind of attention you can't fake, the kind of fascination that comes from genuinely caring about something larger than yourself. She understood even at 10 years old that she was part of a legacy, that these books connected her to generations of women who'd valued knowledge and preservation, and the idea that some things are worth protecting even when the world wants to treat them as disposable. To Emma, that library wasn't just a room full of old books. It was the place where she felt truly seen, where her quiet nature was treated as thoughtfulness rather than shyness, where her careful handling of fragile things was praised rather than dismissed as being too serious for a child, where great-grandmother Helen looked at her and saw not a disappointment or an afterthought but an heir, someone worthy of inheriting something precious. And my parents had looked at that sanctuary, that irreplaceable space where my daughter felt safe and valued and connected to something meaningful, and they'd seen nothing but square footage that could be better utilized for entertainment. They'd seen walls that could be knocked down, shelves that could be removed, a climate control system that could be repurposed. They'd seen $265,000 in liquidated assets that could buy recliners and a projection screen and acoustic panels. They didn't just sell a collection, they didn't just violate a trust, they incinerated the only place where my daughter had ever felt like she truly belonged, and they'd done it without hesitation, without consultation, without even the courtesy of a phone call to ask if maybe, possibly, this might be something we should discuss before they destroyed it. They'd simply made the decision that Victoria's children deserved a home theater more than Emma deserved her inheritance, that their comfort mattered more than her future, that we were expendable in ways Victoria's family never would be, and they'd expected me to accept this the way I'd accepted everything else, quietly, gratefully, without making a scene. They'd assumed I would stay silent because I always had, assumed the invisible chains of my survival mechanism would hold me in place, assumed that 34 years of conditioning would prevent me from doing anything more than maybe crying in private, and then showing up to Sunday dinner with a forced smile, and an unwillingness to cause conflict. They'd calculated based on historical data that I was safe to exploit, that I would absorb this injury the way I'd absorbed all the others, that I would eventually rationalize their cruelty as just how things worked in families, just the price of being the responsible daughter, just something I needed to accept and move past because holding grudges isn't what good people do. But they'd miscalculated catastrophically because when they targeted Emma, when they took from my daughter instead of from me, they broke the very mechanism that had kept me compliant for 3 decades. The internal contract that bound me to their whims had a clause they'd forgotten about. I would tolerate being overlooked, being undervalued, being used. I would tolerate almost anything as long as it only hurt me. But the moment they reached past me to hurt my child, the moment they taught Emma the same lesson I'd learned in that hallway at 19, that she didn't matter enough to protect, that her needs were negotiable while other children's wants were sacred, that moment they'd shredded every agreement we'd ever had, every unspoken rule that had governed our relationship, every reason I'd ever had to stay silent. The invisible bars were gone, not broken but dissolved, revealed as the illusion they'd always been, and for the first time in my entire life, I wasn't interested in being useful, wasn't interested in being the daughter who made things easier, who absorbed the hurt, who kept the peace. I was interested in being heard, in being acknowledged, in making sure they understood that actions have consequences, even when those actions are committed by parents against children who are supposed to forgive. Everything because family. My phone started ringing before I'd even pulled out of their driveway, my mother's name flashing on the screen with the kind of persistence that suggested she'd already realized something was wrong, that maybe the caterers had called about the canceled deposit, that maybe someone from the historical registry had reached out about my non-compliance filing. I let it ring, let it go to voicemail, listened to the notification chime that told me she'd left a message, and then I watched as she called. Again and again, 6 times in the span of 10 minutes, each call a little more desperate than the last, and I didn't answer a single one because I had nothing to say to her, nothing that she would understand, nothing that would penetrate the fortress of her entitlement. Finally, I picked up on the 7th call, not because I wanted to talk, but because I wanted her to hear my silence, wanted her to understand that the daughter she'd relied on for decades was no longer available for damage control. Sarah. My mother's voice came through bright and confused, carefully modulated to sound pleasant despite the obvious tension. Honey, there seems to be some kind of mistake with the caterers. They're saying the deposit was canceled, and I got a very strange email from the historical registry about a compliance issue. I'm sure it's just a clerical error, but could you look into it when you have a moment? I let the silence stretch, let her hear the absence of my usual immediate reassurance, my usual rush to fix whatever problem she'd called about, let her start to understand that something fundamental had shifted. It's not a mistake, Mom, I said finally, my voice calm and factual. I canceled the catering deposit because I'm not paying for Victoria's party, and I filed a non-compliance notice because you gutted a protected historical space to build a home theater. The estate no longer qualifies for landmark status, and the tax exemption will be revoked. Those aren't errors. Those are consequences. The silence on her end was different now, sharper. I could almost hear her brain working to process what I'd said, to find the angle that would let her reframe this as me being unreasonable, being overly sensitive, being difficult. Sarah, you're being dramatic, she said, and her voice had that edge of condescension that I'd been hearing my entire life, the tone that said I was making a problem out of nothing, that I needed to calm down and see reason. Emma is only 10 years old. She can read digital copies of those books just as easily as the physical ones. And the theater is for all the grandchildren. It's not like we were playing favorites. We were thinking about family togetherness, about creating space where everyone can enjoy time together. I almost laughed at the audacity of it, at her ability to rewrite reality so completely that stealing from one grandchild to benefit others became an act of family unity. But I didn't laugh. I just let her words hang in the air between us, let her hear how hollow they sounded. You sold $265,000 of Emma's inheritance without asking me, I said. You liquidated a collection that great-grandmother Helen specifically left to her. You destroyed the only place where she felt safe and valued, and you did it to build an entertainment room for Victoria's kids. That's not family togetherness, Mom. That's favoritism so extreme it crosses into theft. And I'm done pretending it's anything else. She tried to argue, but I hung up, didn't give her the opportunity to spin this into something I needed to get over, didn't give her the chance to make me feel guilty for setting a boundary. I blocked her number and my father's and Victoria's, cleared the family group chat from my phone, and felt something lift off my shoulders, something heavy that I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. But I wasn't done. Not even close, because the next call I made was to my colleague at the State University's Rare Books Department, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chun who'd been trying to acquire certain pieces for the university's collection for years, pieces she knew existed in the Catherine collection because great-grandmother Helen had shown her photographs during an oral history project. And when I told her that there were significant irregularities involving the collection, that items had been removed from the estate and sold to private collectors without proper documentation, her voice went from friendly to professional in seconds. She understood immediately what I was telling her. Understood that this wasn't a family dispute anymore. This was a potential violation of cultural heritage law, and she told me she'd initiate a formal inquiry within the hour, would contact the university's legal counsel, would start the process of investigating whether protected historical assets had been improperly alienated from their designated trust. I didn't do this out of spite. That's crucial to understand. I did it because the moment I started looking at the actual legal structure of how great-grandmother Helen had left that collection to Emma, I realized that my parents hadn't just been morally wrong to sell it, they'd been legally prohibited from selling it because Helen hadn't given them the books with permission to do whatever they wanted. She'd placed them in a registered cultural heritage trust with Emma as the beneficiary and my parents as temporary custodians. Their role was to preserve and protect until Emma reached 18. Their role was explicitly not to liquidate for personal benefit, and by selling the collection they'd violated the terms of the trust, had committed what was legally classified as misappropriation of protected cultural assets. And that wasn't something I could ignore, even if I'd wanted to, because ignoring it would make me complicit in the destruction of exactly the kind of heritage I'd spent my career protecting. So, I did what I was trained to do. I documented everything. I filed the appropriate reports. I initiated the proper channels. I treated my parents the way I would treat any institution that had violated preservation law, with professional detachment and absolute precision. And as I sat in my car watching the sun set behind Blackwood Manor, watching the lights come on in the new theater wing where my daughter's future had been converted into surround sound, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt powerful. Not in a vengeful way, but in the way you feel when you finally stop accepting unacceptable treatment, when you finally use the skills and knowledge you possess to protect what matters instead of enabling what doesn't. And I knew that what came next was going to destroy the carefully constructed image my parents had spent decades building, was going to expose them in ways they'd never imagined possible, because they'd made the fatal mistake of stealing from someone whose mother knew exactly how to dismantle the systems they relied on, and I was just getting started. The email I drafted that night was a masterpiece of professional restraint, every word chosen for maximum impact with minimum emotion. I sent it to the family group chat at exactly 11 p.m. when I knew they'd all be awake, but too tired to mount an immediate coordinated response. The subject line read Notice of Heritage Trust Audit, and the body was 3 paragraphs of devastating clarity. I have initiated a full inventory and compliance review of the Helen Catherine Heritage Trust, I wrote, using great-grandmother Helen's full legal name to make it clear this was official business. Any missing assets must be accounted for within 48 hours. All custodial decisions made regarding trust property in the past 12 months must be documented and justified. Failure to comply will result in referral to the State Attorney General's Office for investigation of potential misappropriation of protected cultural assets. I attached the trust documents that Helen had filed with the state 22 years ago, documents my parents had apparently never bothered to read carefully, documents that made it crystal clear that they'd never owned the collection, had never had the authority to sell it, had been nothing more than temporary caretakers with explicitly limited powers. I watched the read receipts pop up in rapid succession, Mom at 11:03, Dad at 11:04, Victoria at 11:07, and then the typing indicators started appearing and disappearing as they tried to figure out what to say, how to respond to a daughter who just transformed from compliant family member into legal adversary in the space of a single email. I imagined them in different rooms of that enormous house, my mother probably in bed with her silk eye mask pushed up on her forehead, my father in his study with a whiskey he suddenly needed more than usual, Victoria in the guest wing she'd moved into after her divorce, all of them trying to process that the person they'd relied on to keep their comfortable life running smoothly had just become the person who could destroy it. The first response came from my father at 11:34. "Sarah, this is completely unnecessary and frankly hostile. The books were sold to help the family, to create a space where all the grandchildren could benefit. Your grandmother would have wanted us to be flexible and practical rather than bound by outdated legal paperwork. Let's discuss this like adults instead of hiding behind bureaucratic threats." I almost admired the audacity of it, the way he'd tried to reframe theft as flexibility, the way he'd invoked Helen's wishes despite having ignored her explicit written instructions, the way he'd called my legal action hostile while seeing nothing hostile about liquidating my daughter's inheritance without permission. I didn't respond, didn't engage with his attempt to make this about my tone rather than his actions. I just opened my laptop and continued the work I'd started, because while they were crafting responses and trying to figure out damage control, I was 6 hours deep into a comprehensive audit of every transaction related to the estate in the past 2 years, and what I was finding was even worse than I'd imagined. They hadn't just sold Emma's books, they'd been systematically liquidating other trust assets for months, small pieces at first, a silver tea service that had been cataloged as part of the historical household collection, a set of antique maps that were supposed to remain with the estate, a collection of Civil War correspondence that had been donated to the Historical Society in Helen's name, but had somehow ended up at auction in Atlanta. My parents had been treating the entire estate like a personal bank account, withdrawing assets whenever they needed cash, assuming no one would notice because I was too busy managing the paperwork to actually audit what they were doing, assuming that great-grandmother Helen's declining health meant she wouldn't remember what she'd owned, assuming that their status as legal residents of the property gave them the right to dispose of its contents. They'd been wrong on every count, and the evidence I was compiling was damning enough to trigger not just a civil lawsuit but potential criminal charges for theft of cultural property. The state university's legal response came faster than I'd expected. Dr. Chen must have made calls over the weekend because by Monday morning I had an email from the university's general counsel, a man named Marcus Webb, whose reputation for aggressive heritage protection was legendary in archival circles. He'd successfully sued private collectors, auction houses, and even other universities for improper acquisition of cultural assets, and his email was brief and lethal. "Miss Madison, I've reviewed the documentation you provided regarding the Helen Catherine Heritage Trust. The university has a vested interest in this matter as several items from the collection were promised to our archives upon the trust's completion. The sale of trust assets to private parties without proper authorization represents a serious breach of cultural heritage law. We are prepared to initiate legal proceedings to recover the assets and pursue appropriate penalties. Please confirm your availability for a call this week to discuss next steps." I forwarded that email to the family group chat without comment. Let them see that this wasn't just me being difficult, that actual lawyers with actual power were now involved, that the comfortable bubble they'd been living in was about to pop in very public and very expensive ways. And then I did something that felt both petty and necessary. I started documenting everything for social media. Not to post immediately, but to have ready when the time came because I knew my family well enough to know that they would try to control the narrative, would try to paint me as the ungrateful, difficult daughter who turned against her loving family over a minor disagreement, and I wanted receipts, wanted timestamps, wanted evidence that couldn't be spun or reinterpreted. I took screenshots of every text message where my mother had asked me to pay for Victoria's expenses, every email where my father had reminded me that family helps family, every group chat message where they discussed their plans for the estate without ever thinking to include me in the decision-making. I documented the historical tax exemption savings, calculated exactly how much my unpaid labor had been worth over 6 years, compiled a spreadsheet showing every financial contribution I'd made to family expenses versus every dollar they'd spent on Victoria. The numbers were staggering. I'd contributed over $200,000 in direct payments and saved labor to a family that had given me back nothing except expectations and criticism, while Victoria had received well over $500,000 in gifts, loans that were never repaid, and now a $265,000 theater wing built with stolen money. Hey, I want to pause here for a second and ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you realized your family had been keeping score, but only counting what you owed them, never what they owed you? If you're watching this and you've been the family member who gives and gives while everyone else just takes, do me a favor and drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever had that moment where you finally saw the imbalance clearly, and while you're here, from our stats, we've got way more viewers than subscribers. If this story is resonating with you, if you're feeling seen by what I'm sharing, kindly join our community by hitting that subscribe button. I'm building something here, a space where the invisible children, the responsible daughters, the ones who were told they were too sensitive when they asked for basic fairness, can tell their stories without shame. Thank you. Now let's get back to what happened next because trust me, it gets so much worse before it gets better. The university's legal team moved with a kind of efficiency that comes from having done this before. Within 72 hours of my initial report, they'd identified the private collector who'd purchased Emma's books, a wealthy businessman named Richard Pemberton who ran in the same social circles as my parents, who'd apparently been thrilled to acquire such a prestigious collection at what he believed was a legitimate private sale. Marcus Webb, the university attorney, called me on Wednesday afternoon to walk me through what they discovered, and his voice had the kind of grim satisfaction that lawyers get when they've found something really damaging. Miss Madison, he said, we've confirmed that the collection was sold to Mr. Pemberton for $265,000, paid in full via wire transfer to an account controlled by your parents. Mr. Pemberton has provided us with a bill of sale, which is where things get interesting. The sale was executed by your father representing himself as the trustee with full authority to liquidate assets, but according to the trust documents your grandmother filed, no such authority exists. The trust explicitly states that all major decisions require written consent from both the custodians and the beneficiary's legal guardian. That's you, and we can find no evidence that you were ever consulted or that you provided consent. I felt my hands go numb holding the phone. They forged my consent, I said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. They sold my daughter's inheritance, and they forged documents to make it look legal. We believe so, Marcus said carefully. Mr. Pemberton is quite distressed to learn he may be in possession of stolen property. He's a collector who prides himself on ethical acquisition, and he's indicated he would cooperate fully with recovering the assets. But Miss Madison, I need you to understand what we're looking at here. This isn't just a civil matter anymore. Forgery of legal documents in connection with the sale of protected cultural property is a felony if your parents knowingly misrepresented their authority to sell. If they created false documentation to facilitate the sale, they could be facing criminal charges, and given the dollar amount involved, we're talking about serious prison time. The words hung in the air between us. Serious prison time. My parents, who'd spent their entire lives building an image of respectability, who'd valued their social status above everything else, who'd treated their position in the community like an inherited title that came with their last name, they were facing the possibility of becoming convicted felons, of losing not just their money but their freedom, their reputation, everything they'd used to justify their cruelty, and I felt something. That surprised me. I felt grief, not for them but for the parents I'd wished they'd been, for the family I'd wanted us to be, for the childhood I deserved but never got. I was grieving the fantasy while watching the reality burn, and both things were happening simultaneously, the sadness and the satisfaction, the loss and the justice. Marcus continued talking, explaining next steps, timelines, legal procedures, but I was only half listening because my phone was buzzing with incoming texts. Victoria had apparently decided that direct communication was worth breaking the silence I'd imposed. Her messages came rapid fire, each one more desperate than the last. Sarah, you need to stop this. You're going to destroy the entire family over some old books. Do you have any idea what this is doing to Mom and Dad? They can't sleep. They can't eat. Dad's business is suffering because word is getting out. People are asking questions. This is so incredibly selfish. You always had to be the victim. Always had to make everything about you. Just because you're jealous that my kids got something nice doesn't mean you get to ruin everyone's life. I can't believe you're doing this to your own family. What kind of person are you? I read the messages with a detachment that would have been impossible a week ago, saw the manipulation tactics laid bare, the guilt tripping, the accusations of jealousy, the reframing of consequences as persecution, the complete absence of any acknowledgement that maybe, possibly, selling a child's inheritance without permission might have been wrong. Victoria was so thoroughly convinced of her own victimhood that she genuinely couldn't see how her text messages were proving exactly why I'd had to do this. She'd been raised to believe that her comfort mattered more than other people's rights, that her family's reputation was more important than honesty or legality or basic human decency, and she was never going to understand that those beliefs had consequences. I didn't respond to Victoria, didn't try to explain or justify or defend. I just forwarded her messages to Marcus with a note. This is the kind of pressure I'm receiving from family members. I thought you should have it documented. And then I turned my phone on Do Not Disturb and went back to the work that actually mattered, which was helping the university's legal team build an airtight case for recovering Emma's collection, for exposing the fraud my parents had committed, for making sure that what they'd done to my daughter became a matter of public record that couldn't be hidden or spun, or explained away as a misunderstanding between family members. By Friday, the story had leaked. Someone, probably an employee at the historical registry, or maybe someone who'd seen the legal filings, had tipped off the local newspaper, and suddenly my parents' theft wasn't a private family matter anymore. It was news. The headline read, "Local prominent family under investigation for heritage trust violation," and the article laid out the basic facts with devastating clarity. Richard Madison and Patricia Madison, residents of the historically designated Blackwood Manor, were under investigation for the unauthorized sale of protected cultural assets belonging to a heritage trust established by Helen Catherine Madison. The trust, which included rare first-edition books valued at over $250,000, had been designated for the benefit of the couple's 10-year-old granddaughter. Sources close to the investigation confirmed that the items were sold without proper authorization and that the proceeds were used for personal home renovations. I read the article 3 times, savoring the way the truth looked when it was printed in black and white, when it couldn't be argued with or reframed, when it just existed as fact that anyone could verify. My parents had been exposed not as victims of a difficult daughter, but as people who'd stolen from their own grandchild, and the social consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The comment section on the newspaper's website was brutal. People my parents had known for decades were weighing in with shock and disappointment. Former business associates were distancing themselves. Social acquaintances were sharing the article with captions like, "I always thought something was off about that family." The image they'd spent their entire lives building, the reputation they'd valued above everything, including their relationship with me, was disintegrating in real time, and I was the one who'd lit the match. And the fire was spreading faster than they could ever hope to contain. But what they didn't know yet, what I hadn't told anyone except Marcus and Dr. Chin, was that the books were just the beginning, because when I'd started auditing the estate's assets, I'd found something else, something that great-grandmother Helen had left in her will that my parents either didn't know about or had hoped I'd never discover, something that would take everything they thought they owned and prove they'd never owned any of it at all. The document I found buried in the county recorder's office archive was dated 23 years ago, filed 6 months before great-grandmother Helen had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia, and it was titled Declaration of Conditional Life Estate with Reversionary Interest, legal language that most people would skim over without understanding its implications. But I'd spent 6 years studying property law as it related to historical preservation, and I understood exactly what I was looking at, exactly what Helen had done, and exactly why my parents were about to lose everything they thought they owned. I sat in the records room of the county courthouse with fluorescent lights humming overhead and my hands shaking as I photographed every page. Helen had been brilliant, viciously brilliant in a way that only someone who truly understood her family's capacity for greed could be. She hadn't given Blackwood Manor to my father, hadn't deeded it to him outright the way he'd always claimed. She'd granted him and my mother a conditional life estate, which meant they had the right to live there, to occupy the property, to present themselves as the owners, but only as long as they met specific requirements, specific obligations that were spelled out in excruciating detail in the trust document, and the primary condition, the one that invalidated everything the moment it was violated, was that they maintain the property as a historical landmark and preserve all designated heritage assets including but not limited to the Catherine Rare Book collection in perpetuity for the benefit of future generations. My parents didn't own Blackwood Manor. They never had. They were tenants with conditions, caretakers with responsibilities, and the moment they sold Emma's books, the moment they gutted that climate-controlled library to build a theater wing, the moment they violated the preservation requirements, They triggered an automatic termination of their life estate. The property reverted immediately to the trust, and the trust, according to the document I was holding, designated Emma as the remainder beneficiary, meaning that when the life estate terminated for any reason, the entire property, all 5 acres, the house, the gardens, everything, it all became Emma's. My 10-year-old daughter, who they'd stolen from, now owned the house they'd been living in, and they'd been the ones who triggered the transfer by their own actions. I called Marcus Webb from my car in the courthouse parking lot, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I found something," I said, and I emailed him photos of the trust document while we were still on the phone. I heard him go silent as he read, heard his breath catch as he understood what he was looking at, heard him say "holy hell" under his breath in a tone that mixed shock with professional admiration. "Miss Madison," he said finally, "do your parents know about this document? Have they ever seen this trust declaration?" "If they had, they wouldn't have sold the books," I said. "They've been living under the assumption that they inherited the property outright. They've been telling people for over 20 years that they own Blackwood Manor. They've taken out loans against it. They've used it as collateral. They've made major modifications without realizing they didn't have the authority. They've been occupying property they had no right to alter." "This changes everything," Marcus said, his lawyer voice kicking into high gear. "This isn't just about recovering the books anymore. This is about the entire estate. Your daughter is the legal owner of a property worth—" He paused. "I'm looking at recent sales comps for the area. A historical estate of that size and condition. We're talking somewhere between $3 and $4 million. Your parents have been living in your daughter's house, making improvements to your daughter's property with money stolen from your daughter's trust. The irony is almost poetic." I thought about my father's home office, the place where he'd sit behind his imported mahogany desk and lecture me about financial responsibility, about not living beyond my means, about the importance of building wealth through smart investments, and the entire time he'd been living in a house he didn't own, building his construction empire using a property as collateral that legally belonged to his granddaughter. Every loan he'd taken, every line of credit he'd secured using Blackwood Manor as an asset, it was all based on a lie, based on him misrepresenting his ownership of property he only had conditional use of, and now that the conditions had been violated, now that the life estate had terminated, he was about to discover that his financial house of cards had been built on land that wasn't his. "We need to file for immediate possession," Marcus said. "I'll draft an emergency motion for Monday morning, but Miss Madison, I need you to understand what this means. We're not just recovering books. We're evicting your parents from a multi-million-dollar estate. This is going to be," he searched for the right word, "nuclear. This is going to destroy them financially and socially. Are you prepared for that level of conflict?" "They destroyed my daughter's sense of safety," I said quietly. "They stole her inheritance and used it to build a theater for other children. They've spent my entire life teaching me that I don't matter as much as Victoria, that my child doesn't deserve the same consideration as her children. So yes, Marcus, I'm prepared. I'm prepared to show them that actions have consequences even when you're used to buying your way out of accountability. File the motion. Do it Monday. I want them to get served in front of witnesses so they can't claim they never received it. I want this to be as public and as undeniable as what they did to Emma." That weekend I didn't hear from my parents directly, but I heard about them through the whispers that travel through small wealthy communities faster than actual news. Apparently my mother had called an emergency meeting of her garden club, had tried to position herself as the victim of a vindictive daughter, had cried real tears while explaining that I'd always been difficult, always been jealous of Victoria, always been ungrateful for everything they'd provided, but the performance hadn't landed the way she'd expected because several members of the garden club had already read the newspaper article, had already started asking uncomfortable questions about how exactly the Madison family financed their lifestyle, had already begun to wonder if the generous donations Patricia made to various charities were funded by money that wasn't actually hers to give. My father fared even worse. His construction companies started losing bids on major projects. Clients who'd worked with Madison and Sons Development for years suddenly found other firms. Contractors who'd been loyal for decades started returning his calls slower or not at all. The business community had decided that association with someone under investigation for heritage theft was bad for their own reputations, and they were cutting ties with the efficiency of surgeons removing infected tissue. Richard Madison, who'd spent 40 years building his company, building his network, building his status as one of the region's most successful developers, was watching it all evaporate because he'd been too arrogant to read the fine print on his own mother's estate documents. Victoria's collapse was the most public and the most satisfying. Her Instagram following, which she'd spent years cultivating, which she'd monetized into her primary income through sponsorship deals and affiliate marketing, began hemorrhaging followers by the thousands. The algorithm that had once favored her carefully curated content now buried it, and the comments on her posts, especially the ones showing off the new theater wing, turned vicious. People called her complicit, called her a beneficiary of theft, pointed out that she'd been posting about family values and gratitude while her parents were stealing from a child. Her sponsorship deals started falling through, brands distancing themselves from the controversy, influencer agencies dropping her from their rosters, and she responded the way she always did when reality intruded on her fantasy. She posted a tearful video claiming she was the victim of a coordinated attack by jealous people who couldn't stand to see her success, claiming she'd had no idea about the trust violation, claiming she'd been as shocked as anyone to learn about the books. I watched that video twice, studying her performance, and I saw something I'd never noticed before. Victoria actually believed her own lies, actually thought she was blameless, actually couldn't comprehend that building a theater with stolen money made her complicit even if she hadn't personally forged the documents. She'd been raised in a system where consequences were things that happened to other people, where mistakes got blamed on circumstances, where her comfort was always someone else's responsibility to provide, and she genuinely could not process that the rules applied to her too, that her ignorance wasn't innocence, that benefiting from theft made her a thief even if she hadn't wielded the pen that signed the fraudulent papers. The eviction notice was served on Monday morning at 9 a.m. I know because Marcus called me from the courthouse steps to tell me the process server had just left, headed to Blackwood Manor with documents that would give my parents 72 hours to vacate the premises. The motion had been granted by Judge Catherine Morrison, a woman known for her strict interpretation of property law, who'd read the trust documents and the evidence of violation and had ruled from the bench without hesitation. The life estate is terminated effective immediately, she'd said according to Marcus. The occupants have no legal standing to remain on the property. Immediate possession is granted to the trust beneficiary. I was professional enough to wait until I'd hung up with Marcus before I let myself feel it. The wave of vindication, so intense it felt physical. My parents, who'd spent decades treating our home like their personal kingdom, were about to learn they'd been squatting in my daughter's castle. I drove to Blackwood Manor that afternoon, parked across the street where I could watch without being seen, and I witnessed the moment the process server handed my father the documents. He was in the driveway washing his Range Rover, performing weekend relaxation in designer casual wear, and I saw his face go through a progression of emotions as he read: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally something that looked like genuine fear. He called for my mother. She came outside wearing gardening gloves and a sun hat, the picture of wealthy suburban leisure, and I watched through my car window as he showed her the papers, as her face went pale, as her hand flew to her throat in a gesture I recognized from childhood, the one she made when reality refused to cooperate with her preferred narrative. They didn't see me watching, didn't know I was there documenting this moment, taking photos of their shock, their panic, their first real understanding that they'd miscalculated catastrophically. My father got on his phone immediately, probably calling lawyers, probably trying to find someone who would tell him this was fixable, that there was a loophole, that money could make this go away the way money had always made their problems disappear. But there was no loophole in a properly executed trust document. No amount of money that could undo the automatic termination they'd triggered themselves. They built their theater on quicksand, and now it was swallowing everything. That evening I received a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was great-grandmother Helen's nurse from the memory care facility, Miss Madison, she said, her voice warm and slightly conspiratorial. I thought you should know that Mrs. Helen has been asking for you. She's having one of her clear days, those are rare now. And she specifically asked if the plan had worked yet. She's been asking about that plan for months, but today she was lucid enough to explain what she meant. I think you should come visit if you can. I drove to the facility with my heart pounding, walked through corridors that smelled like lavender and industrial cleaner, Found Helen in her room sitting in her armchair with a lap blanket and a cup of tea, and when I entered, she looked up with eyes that were suddenly, impossibly clear. The fog of dementia temporarily lifted like curtains pulled back to reveal the sharp, intelligent woman who'd raised my father, who'd watched him become exactly what she'd feared, who'd planned 23 years ago for this exact moment. "Sarah," she said, her voice stronger than I'd heard in months. "Did they sell the books?" "Yes, Grandma," I said, sitting beside her, taking her hand. "They sold Emma's collection to build a theater wing. They gutted your library." She smiled, actually smiled, and it was the most triumphant expression I'd ever seen on someone in their 80s. "Good," she said, "then the trap worked. They triggered the reversion clause. Emma owns the house now, doesn't she?" "Yes," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Yes, Grandma. Emma owns Blackwood Manor. They're being evicted. They're losing everything." Helen squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "I knew Richard would do it eventually," she said. "I knew his greed would outweigh his sense. I just needed to wait, needed to set up the dominoes and trust that he'd be stupid enough to knock them over himself. I couldn't save your mother from marrying him, couldn't stop her from choosing a man who saw people as assets, but I could protect you, could protect Emma, could make sure that when he finally showed his true nature it cost him everything he valued." We sat together for an hour, Helen drifting in and out of clarity, sometimes forgetting who I was, sometimes sharp as broken glass, and during one of her clear moments, she told me something I'd never known. "I wrote that trust the week after your father told Patricia that you didn't need support because you'd be fine on your own," Helen said. "I heard him say that daughters were low-maintenance investments, that you'd figure things out, and I realized my son had become the kind of man who valued children based on their return on investment. So I built a trap. I gave him a house he thought he owned, let him build his empire on what he believed was his foundation, and I put a clause in the trust that I knew he'd eventually violate because men like Richard can't help themselves. They always take more than they're entitled to. They always believe rules don't apply to them. I just had to wait for him to prove me right." "And he did," I said. "He proved you right in the worst possible way." Helen nodded, already starting to drift again, her moment of clarity fading. "Protect Emma," she murmured. "Teach her that some people will take everything if you let them. Teach her to build doors they can't walk through. Teach her." Her voice trailed off. But I understood. I understood that Helen had spent the last 2 decades of her life building a door that my father couldn't walk through, couldn't buy his way through, couldn't charm or manipulate or threaten his way through. She'd built it out of legal documents and careful planning and a deep understanding of exactly what kind of person her son was, and now Emma and I were standing on the other side of that door watching my parents realize they'd locked themselves out of everything they'd believed was theirs, and the reckoning that was coming, the complete and total destruction of their carefully constructed life. It was all about to happen in the most public way possible. The theater reveal party was still scheduled for Saturday evening despite everything, or maybe because of everything. My parents had apparently decided that the best response to multiple legal crises was to pretend they weren't happening, to maintain the appearance of normalcy, to host their event as if the eviction notice taped to their front door was just an administrative error that would resolve itself through sheer force of their denial. I received the invitation via email on Wednesday morning, a digital card dripping with gold accents and script font that probably cost more than it should have. "You're invited to the grand premiere of the Madison Family Theater." The text read, "Join us for an evening of celebration as we unveil our newest addition to Blackwood Manor. Cocktails at 7, screening at 8. The tone was triumphant, oblivious, and I realized my parents were so deeply committed to their delusion that they were planning to celebrate their theft even as the walls were literally closing in around them. My mother had even added a personal note at the bottom. "Sarah, I hope you can put aside this unpleasantness and join us as a family. Victoria and the children are so excited to share this moment. Let's not let legal misunderstandings ruin what should be a joyful occasion." I stared at that message for a long time, at the way she'd reduced the theft of her granddaughter's inheritance to an unpleasantness, the way she'd framed fraud and eviction as legal misunderstandings, the way she'd positioned my presence at their celebration as a test to my character rather than questioning the character it took to throw a party with stolen money, and I made a decision that surprised even me. I accepted the invitation, clicked yes on the RSVP form because I wanted to be there, wanted to be present in the room when reality finally crashed through their delusion, wanted to witness the moment they understood that consequence wasn't something you could reschedule for a more convenient time. I didn't tell Marcus I was planning to attend, didn't mention it to anyone except Emma, who asked quietly if we were really going to Grandma and Grandpa's party, and I knelt down to her level, looked into eyes that were too old for 10 years and said, "Yes, baby, we're going," because sometimes you need to see the end of something to believe it's really over. Sometimes you need to watch the people who hurt you face what they've done, not for revenge, but for closure, so you can move forward. Knowing that justice isn't just a concept, it's a real thing that actually happens, and she nodded with that solemn understanding she developed since the day they sold her books, since the day she'd learned that even grandparents could be thieves. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of perfect weather that seemed cosmically unfair, clear skies, temperature in the mid-70s, the kind of evening that was made for garden parties and celebration. I dressed carefully, not too formal but not casual. I wanted to look like someone who belonged there, someone who had every right to walk through those doors. I picked up great-grandmother Helen from the memory care facility. She'd been having more clear days recently, the doctor said it. Sometimes happen near the end, these windows of lucidity like a gift, and when I told her where we were going she'd smiled that sharp smile and said I wouldn't miss this for anything. Let them see what they built on sand. Blackwood Manor was glowing when we arrived, every window lit, every pathway lined with luminarias, luxury vehicles crowding the circular driveway. Inside I could hear laughter and music, the sound of people who had no idea they were attending a funeral. We walked up the front steps together, Helen leaning on my arm, Emma holding my hand. 3 generations of Madison women who'd been overlooked and undervalued and stolen from, walking into a house that legally belonged to the youngest among us. And I felt something shift in the air, some change in pressure that meant the storm was finally here. My mother met us at the door, her face flickering through emotions so fast I could barely track them, surprise at seeing us, fear at seeing Helen, who wasn't supposed to be lucid enough to attend events, confusion about what our presence meant, and underneath it all a desperate hope that maybe we were here to forgive, to let bygones be bygones, to pretend like none of this had happened. "Sarah, Catherine, Emma," she said, her voice bright and brittle. "I'm so glad you could make it, everyone is. Just gathering in the new wing. You're going to love what we've done with the space. The acoustics alone are worth." She trailed off, realizing that mentioning the acoustics meant acknowledging the room they'd built with Emma's stolen inheritance. We moved through the house in silence, past family photographs that documented a history I no longer felt part of, past furniture that now legally belonged to my daughter, past rooms where I'd spent my childhood learning that love was something you earned through usefulness. The new theater wing had been built where the library used to stand. They'd knocked down walls to create one large space, installed tiered seating with leather recliners, a screen that covered the entire far wall, acoustic, panels on the ceiling, a popcorn machine in the corner. Like this was an actual cinema rather than a monument to their theft. The room was filled with people, my parents' friends, Victoria's social media crowd, business associates who didn't yet know they were about to witness a disaster, everyone holding champagne, everyone admiring the space, everyone complicit in celebrating what should have been a crime scene. My father was standing at the front near the screen, wearing a suit that probably cost $3,000, holding a glass of champagne, looking like a man whose life was going exactly according to plan. He saw us enter, and his face went through the same progression my mother's had: surprise, fear, confusion. He hadn't expected us, hadn't thought we'd have the audacity to show up at his celebration. And I saw him trying to calculate whether our presence was a white flag or a declaration of war. Victoria was beside him, her phone out, probably live streaming to her Instagram, probably trying to salvage her influencer career by showing her followers that the family drama was overblown, that we were all together and happy and fine. Helen didn't wait for anyone to start, didn't let my father take control of the room the way he always did. She just walked forward with her cane clicking against the expensive new flooring, and the sound cut through the conversations like a knife. People stopped talking, turned to look, recognized her as the matriarch who'd been mostly absent from family events due to her declining health, and something about her presence, about the way she carried herself with absolute authority despite her age, made the room go silent in a way that felt almost reverent. My father's face went pale. He knew, somehow he knew that she wasn't here to celebrate. "Well, Richard," Helen said, her voice carrying despite her age, "you've certainly been busy. I see you've made some changes to my library." "Mom," my father started, his voice thin, "we were going to talk to you about the remodel. The doctor said you weren't having many good days and we didn't want to burden you with decisions. We thought—" Helen held up her hand, the same gesture she'd used to silence him when he was a child. "I know exactly what you thought. You thought I was too far gone to notice, too confused to understand, too diminished to matter. You thought you could liquidate assets you didn't own, modify property you had no right to alter, and no one would stop you because the woman who actually owned this house was locked away in a facility with a degenerative brain disease." She paused. "Let that sink in. You underestimated me, Richard. You always have, just like you underestimated your daughter, just like you underestimated your granddaughter. You've spent your whole life underestimating the women in this family, and now you're going to pay for it." The crowd was leaning in now, sensing drama, pulling out phones. This was going to be recorded, going to be shared, going to become the story that defined the Madison family for decades. My mother tried to intervene. "Catherine, please, this is supposed to be a celebration. Let's not do this here. Let's talk privately like family," but Helen ignored her completely. Helen's gaze swept across the room, taking in the theater seats, the screen, the acoustic panels. "You sold Emma's collection for this," she said, making it a statement, not a question. "You took books that I spent 50 years acquiring, books that I specifically designated for my great-granddaughter, books that were registered as protected cultural heritage, and you liquidated them to build a room where you could watch movies. You turned voices from the past into surround sound speakers. You converted scholarship into entertainment. You chose comfort over legacy and theft over honor." My father tried to speak, but his voice came out wrong. Too high, too defensive. "We improved the property," he managed to say. "We increased its value. We made it better." Helen smiled, and it was the coldest expression I'd ever seen. "Improved," she repeated. "You improved stolen property with stolen money. How remarkably efficient. But here's the thing, Richard. Here's what you never bothered to understand about the property you've been improving. You don't own it. You never did. I gave you a life estate, a conditional right to occupy, and the condition was that you preserve the heritage assets. The moment you sold those books, you violated the terms. The life estate terminated automatically. Every improvement you made, every dollar you spent, you were spending it on someone else's property." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear people breathing, could hear ice settling in glasses, could hear the quiet mechanical hum of the ventilation system. My father's face had gone from pale to gray, the color of old newspaper. "Mom, what are you talking about?" he said. "This house is mine. You left it to me in the will. I've been paying taxes on it for 20 years. "You've been paying taxes on a property you had conditional use of," Helen corrected. "The deed is quite clear. I suggest you read it. Actually, I'll save you the trouble." She turned to look at the crowd, addressing them like they were a jury, which in many ways they were. "The Madison family has been living at Blackwood Manor under a life estate that required them to maintain historical integrity and preserve designated heritage assets by selling the Catherine collection and gutting the library. They violated those terms. The property has reverted to its rightful owner." She gestured toward Emma, who was standing beside me, eyes wide. "My great-granddaughter Emma, who at 10 years old now owns this entire estate. Everything you see, all 5 acres, the house, the gardens, the theater wing you're standing in that was built with money stolen from her. It all belongs to her now. You've been standing in a 10-year-old's living room admiring improvements made with her inheritance." The room erupted, not in applause but in shock, in gasps, in the sound of 100 conversations starting at once. Phones were up now, recording openly. This was news. This was scandal. This was the kind of story that would dominate local gossip for months. My father looked around wildly, looking for support, looking for someone to tell him this was wrong, but the people in that room were backing away, distancing themselves. You could see them mentally revising their association with the Madison family, recalculating whether knowing these people was worth the reputational risk. Victoria had stopped recording, her phone hanging limply at her side, her face the picture of someone watching their entire world collapse. My mother started to cry, real tears now. "Not the performative kind. Catherine, please, this will destroy us. We'll lose everything. We have nowhere to go. Think about Richard's business. Think about Victoria's children. Think about the family. I thought about family, Helen said, her voice soft but cutting. I thought about family when I wrote that trust 23 years ago. I thought about the daughter-in-law who chose to enable abuse rather than prevent it. I thought about the son who valued money over character. I thought about the granddaughter who was taught she didn't matter. I thought about the great-granddaughter who was about to learn the same lesson. So I built a trap. I gave you rope and waited for you to hang yourselves with it, and you did. You did exactly what I knew you would, because people like you always do. You always take more than you're entitled to. You always believe the rules don't apply. You always assume that no one is watching, or that if they are, they won't have the courage to stop you. But I was watching, Richard. I've always been watching, and I built Sarah to have the courage you thought she didn't possess. My father turned to me then, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. Sarah, he said, his voice breaking, you can stop this. You're my daughter. You can tell them this is a misunderstanding. You can fix this. You've always fixed things, please. I'm begging you. I looked at the man who'd never once told me he was proud of me, who'd measured my worth and how convenient I was to have around, who'd stolen from my child and expected me to smile and pretend it was okay, and I felt nothing, no anger, no satisfaction, no grief, just a cold, clear certainty that this was necessary. I didn't cause this, Dad, I said quietly. You did. Every choice that led here was yours. You chose to sell Emma's books. You chose to forge documents. You chose to violate the trust. You chose to build this theater with stolen money. These are consequences, and I'm not going to save you from them anymore. I'm done being the daughter who fixes your mistakes. I'm done protecting you from reality. You're on your own. The eviction was scheduled for 72 hours after the notice was served, which meant my parents had until Tuesday morning to vacate the premises. The university had already arranged for the return of Emma's book collection. Richard Pemberton, the collector who'd purchased them, was horrified to learn they'd been stolen, was cooperating fully with recovery, was actually paying to have them professionally restored and returned because he said his reputation as an ethical collector mattered more than the money. But the return of the books was just one small piece of justice. The bigger piece was watching my parents pack their belongings into a moving truck, watching them load up furniture and clothes and all the material possessions they'd valued so highly, watching them leave behind the house they'd believed was their kingdom. They moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town, the kind of place they would have looked down on a month ago, the kind of place that didn't have a name, just a number, just an address in a complex where no one cared who you used to be. My father's business collapsed within weeks. Clients who'd been loyal for decades canceled contracts. New bids went unanswered. Employees started leaving. Within 3 months, Madison and Sons Development declared bankruptcy. 40 years of building, 40 years of reputation, 40 years of treating his name like a brand that meant something, gone. Wiped out because he'd been too arrogant to read the fine print on his own inheritance. Victoria fared no better. Her influencer career never recovered from the scandal. Brands wouldn't touch her. Followers kept leaving. Engagement rates plummeted. She eventually deleted all her social media accounts and took a job in retail, working at a department store makeup counter. And I heard through mutual acquaintances that she blamed me for everything, told anyone who would listen that I destroyed the family out of jealousy, that I'd always been bitter about her success, that I'd weaponized legal technicalities because I couldn't stand to see her happy. She never once acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, building a theater with a child's stolen inheritance was wrong. Emma and I moved into Blackwood Manor 3 weeks after my parents vacated. We spent the first week dismantling what remained of the theater wing, removing the screen, removing the seats, removing every trace of what they'd built. And then we began the work of restoration. We reinstalled the climate-controlled shelving, brought back the archival lighting, recreated as closely as possible the library that Helen had designed decades ago. And when Emma's books finally came home, returned from Pemberton's collection in custom-built cases, we placed them back on the shelves where they belonged, and that room stopped being a crime scene and became a sanctuary again. I was exhausted beyond anything I could name, but watching Emma curl up in the wingback chair with a restored first edition in her lap, seeing her small fingers carefully turn pages that had survived centuries, watching her understand that she was part of a legacy that valued preservation over possession, it made everything worth it, made the legal battles worth it, made the family destruction worth it. made the year of fighting worth it because my daughter would grow up in a house that taught her she mattered, that her inheritance was worth protecting, that standing up to thieves was right even when those thieves were your own family, and that justice wasn't just a concept but a real thing that happened when someone loved you enough to fight for it. And I thought about great-grandmother Helen, who'd loved me enough to plan this 23 years in advance, who'd built the weapon I needed and left it where I would find it, who'd understood that sometimes the only way to protect someone is to give them the tools to protect themselves, and I was going to make sure Emma learned that lesson too, was going to raise her to be someone who built doors that couldn't be walked through by people who only valued what they could take. 6 months after we moved into Blackwood Manor, I was sitting in the restored library watching Emma do her homework at the mahogany desk that had once been great-grandmother Helen's. The afternoon sun was streaming through windows we'd had professionally cleaned after years of my parents' neglect, casting warm light across book spines that represented generations of careful curation. And I realized something that made my throat tight. This was the first time in my entire life that I'd felt at home in this house. The first time these walls didn't feel like a prison where I had to earn my right to exist. The first time I could walk through rooms without feeling like I was trespassing in someone else's story. Because this wasn't their story anymore. This was ours, Emma's and mine, and we were writing it on our own terms. The legal aftermath had been exactly as brutal as Marcus predicted. My parents had tried to fight the eviction, had hired 3 different lawyers who all eventually told them the same thing. The trust document was airtight. Helen had known exactly what she was doing. There was no loophole, no technicality, no argument that would restore their occupancy. The conditional life estate had terminated the moment they violated its terms, and no court in the country would overturn a properly executed trust document just because the consequences were severe. My father had tried to claim he didn't know about the conditions, that Helen had never told him, but Marcus had produced correspondence from 23 years ago, letters where Helen had explicitly explained the terms of the life estate, had warned Richard that selling or substantially modifying heritage assets would trigger termination, had made it crystal clear that he was a custodian, not an owner. My father had simply never bothered to read the documents carefully, had assumed that his mother was too sentimental to actually enforce consequences, had believed that his status as her son gave him immunity from accountability. The criminal charges for the forged consent documents were still pending. The district attorney had taken her time building the case, wanted it to be so airtight that no amount of expensive legal defense could create reasonable doubt, and last week Marcus had called to tell me that the grand jury had returned indictments for both my parents, 3 counts each of fraud, forgery, and theft of cultural property. My father was facing up to 15 years in prison if convicted on all counts. My mother was facing 12. Their arraignment was scheduled for next month, and the prosecutor had made it clear she wasn't interested in plea deals. She wanted this case to go to trial, wanted it to be public, wanted it to send a message that stealing from children, even your own grandchildren, especially your own grandchildren, was not something that would be tolerated or minimized or explained away as a family dispute. I thought I would feel satisfaction when I heard about the indictments, thought I would feel vindicated or triumphant or at least relieved that justice was being served, but what I actually felt was complicated, layered, a mix of emotions that didn't resolve into anything simple. I felt grief for the parents I'd wanted them to be, the ones who would have celebrated my achievements instead of dismissing them, who would have valued Emma instead of stealing from her, who would have understood that love isn't supposed to come with conditions and price tags. I felt anger that still surprised me with its intensity, anger at decades of being treated as lesser, anger at watching Victoria get everything while I got obligation, anger at the theft of Emma's sanctuary. But underneath the grief and the anger was something else, something that felt almost like peace, because I'd finally stopped waiting for them to change, stopped hoping they would suddenly develop empathy or conscience or basic human decency. I'd accepted that they were exactly who they'd always been, and I'd stopped letting that define my worth. The family group chat that had once been full of demands and guilt trips and coordination for events I was expected to fund was now silent. I'd left it months ago, blocked everyone, cut off all communication, and the silence was incredible, liberating, like removing a splinter that had been infected for years. I didn't miss them. Didn't miss the constant low-level anxiety of wondering when the next crisis would require my intervention. Didn't miss the performances of family harmony while Underneath everything was transaction and calculation. Didn't miss being the designated problem solver for people who created problems faster than I could fix them. I'd spent 34 years trapped in a dynamic where my role was to be useful, and now I was free, and freedom felt like space, like air, like possibility. Victoria tried to reach out once, about 4 months after the eviction. She sent a letter to Blackwood Manor, actual physical mail, because I'd blocked her on every digital platform. The envelope was expensive stationery, her handwriting was careful and controlled. And the letter inside was 3 pages of self-justification wrapped in the language of forgiveness. Sarah. It began, I know you're angry and I understand why, but I think enough time has passed that we should try to move forward as a family. What happened with the books was a misunderstanding. Mom and Dad made a mistake, but they're paying for it now. They've lost everything, and I don't think you understand how much damage you've caused. Dad's business is gone. Mom's reputation in the community is destroyed. I'm working retail because no one will sponsor me anymore. We're all suffering because you decided to be vindictive instead of forgiving. I know you think you were protecting Emma, but what you really did was destroy the entire family over material possessions, over things that can be replaced. I hope someday you'll realize that revenge isn't the same as justice, and that blood is supposed to be thicker than petty grievances. I'm willing to work toward reconciliation if you are. The children miss their aunt and their cousin, Victoria. I read that letter 3 times, analyzing it the way I would analyze a historical document, looking for what it revealed about the author's worldview, their assumptions, their blind spots, and what I saw was astonishing in its complete lack of self-awareness. Victoria had written 3 pages without once acknowledging that what our parents did was theft, without once admitting that she'd benefited from that theft, without once taking responsibility for celebrating the theater wing while knowing where the money came from. She'd reframed consequences as vindictiveness, justice as revenge, boundaries as petty grievances. She'd positioned herself and our parents as victims of my cruelty rather than architects of their own destruction, and she'd ended by weaponizing the children, using Emma's relationship with her cousins as leverage to try to force reconciliation on her terms. The letter was a masterclass in manipulation, and the old me, the one who'd spent her life being useful and accommodating and desperate for family approval, might have read it and felt guilty, might have wondered if I'd gone too far, might have considered reaching out, but the new me, the one who'd spent 6 months rebuilding a library and watching my daughter heal, just folded the letter carefully and filed it away in a drawer labeled family correspondence, archived for reference, but requiring no response. I never replied to Victoria, never acknowledged the letter, never gave her the engagement she was clearly seeking, and after a few weeks she tried again, sent another letter, this one more desperate, more angry, accusing me directly of enjoying their suffering, of being a vindictive person who'd always been jealous of her, of poisoning Emma against her grandparents and aunt. The accusations were wild, unhinged in places, revealing someone whose carefully constructed identity had collapsed and who was lashing out at anyone she could reach. I filed that letter too, documentation of who they really were when the masks came off, evidence for Emma when she was old enough to understand the full story, proof that I'd made the right choice in cutting them off completely. Great-grandmother Helen passed away 3 months after the theater reveal party, peacefully in her sleep, one of her lucid moments that had become more frequent near the end. She'd squeezed my hand that morning and told me she was proud of me, told me I'd done exactly what she'd hoped I would do, told me that protecting Emma was the most important thing, more important than family harmony, more important than forgiveness, more important than the comfortable lie that blood automatically deserves. Loyalty. She told me that she'd lived to see her trap work perfectly, to see justice served, to see Emma safe in the house that was rightfully hers, and she could go now knowing that the Madison women were finally free of the Madison men's entitlement. She died that night, and at her funeral, which my parents were not invited to, could not attend due to the restraining order Emma had filed with the court. I read a eulogy that talked about a woman who'd understood that love sometimes looks like building weapons for the people you're trying to protect, who'd known that the kindest thing you can do for someone trapped in abuse is give them the tools to escape, who'd valued legacy over comfort and truth over appearances and justice over family peace. The rare book collection had become something more than just Emma's inheritance. It had become a teaching tool, a connection to generations of women who'd valued knowledge, I'd started inviting scholars to visit, to study certain pieces, to use the library for research, always with Emma present, always teaching her that these books weren't meant to be hoarded but shared, that preservation meant both protecting and providing access, that she was the custodian of something larger than herself. And she understood in a way that made me proud, understood that her great-great-grandmother had built this collection for her not to make her rich, but to make her educated, to connect her to voices from the past, to teach her that some things matter more than money, more than comfort, more than the approval of people who see you as disposable. I kept meticulous records of everything, every legal document, every piece of correspondence, every photograph, every news article about my parents' indictments, not because I enjoyed their downfall, but because I wanted Emma to have the full story someday, wanted her to understand exactly what happened and why, wanted her to know that standing up to theft, even theft committed by family, especially theft committed by family, was the right thing to do even when it was hard, even when it destroyed relationships. Even when people called you vindictive and unforgiving and cruel, I wanted her to learn early what it had taken me 34 years to understand, that the people who truly love you don't steal from you, don't lie to you, don't manipulate you, and that cutting off people who do those things isn't cruelty, it's self-preservation, it's dignity. It's refusing to teach them that you'll accept abuse if they package it with the word family. The historical landmark status of Blackwood Manor had been fully restored after extensive documentation that we were now in compliance with all preservation requirements. The climate-controlled library was better than it had ever been. The collection was properly cataloged and insured, and the tax savings that came with landmark designation, that $38,000 annually that my parents had enjoyed for years, now went into a trust fund for Emma's education and for the maintenance of the estate. The money that should have been mine all along was finally being used the way it was intended, not to fund someone else's lifestyle, but to protect and preserve for future generations. And there was poetry in that, justice in that. The wealth they'd built on my unpaid labor was now serving the granddaughter they'd stolen from. The house they'd lost was now generating value for the child they'd victimized. Everything had come full circle in a way that felt cosmically right. I still worked at the university archives, still loved my job, still found satisfaction in preservation work. But I'd been promoted to director of the Rare Books Division, a position that came with significant authority and a salary that meant Emma and I were comfortable, not wealthy in the way my parents had pretended to be, but secure, stable, able to make choices based on what we wanted rather than what we could afford. And that security felt like freedom, felt like the opposite of the anxiety that had defined my childhood. The constant awareness that resources were limited, and I wasn't worth spending them on. Emma would never feel that, would never wonder if she deserved the good things in her life, would never have to earn love through usefulness, because I was going to make sure she understood from day one that she mattered, that her needs were valid, that she deserved protection and advocacy, and a mother who would burn down the world before letting anyone hurt her. The therapy I'd started after the eviction was helping me understand patterns I hadn't even known I was trapped in. My therapist, Dr. Rachel Chen, had specialized knowledge in family systems and narcissistic abuse, and she'd helped me see that my parents' treatment of me wasn't personal, wasn't about my worth or my value. It was about their need for control, their inability to see other people as fully human, their belief that children existed to serve parental needs rather than the other way around. She'd helped me understand that the invisible child syndrome I'd developed, the survival mechanism of staying small and useful, was a normal response to an abnormal situation, that I wasn't weak for adapting to abuse, I was strong for surviving it, and stronger still for finally recognizing it and choosing to leave. She told me something in our last session that I kept coming back to. Healing isn't about forgiving the people who hurt you, it's about forgiving yourself for believing their version of who you were. It's about releasing the story they told about your worth and writing a new one based on truth. So here's what I want you to understand if you're watching this and you're the invisible child in your own family, if you're the one who gives while everyone else takes, if you're the one who's told you're too sensitive when you ask for basic fairness, you're not crazy, you're not overreacting, you're not being vindictive when you set boundaries, you're recognizing abuse and choosing to stop participating in it, and that's not cruelty, that's courage. That's self-respect. That's you finally understanding that you deserve better than people who only value you for what you can provide, and the people who call you selfish for protecting yourself, who accuse you of destroying the family when you stop enabling dysfunction, who try to guilt you back into compliance by invoking blood and loyalty. Those people are telling you exactly who they are, believe them, and build walls they can't climb and doors they can't walk through, because you deserve to live in a house where you're not. Constantly waiting for the next theft, the next betrayal, the next reminder that you don't matter as much as everyone else. Emma looked up from her homework, saw me watching her, and smiled, the kind of smile that's just for sharing space with someone you love, not performing, not seeking approval, just existing together in mutual safety. And I smiled back, thinking about great-grandmother Helen, who'd loved us enough to plan this, who'd built us a fortress disguised as an inheritance, who'd understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is give someone the tools to fight back. And I made a promise to her. Memory, and to Emma, and to myself. I would teach my daughter to be both the archivist and the architect, to preserve what matters and to build doors that protect it, to value legacy over comfort and truth over appearances, to understand that some things are worth fighting for even when the fight costs you everything you thought you needed, because what you actually need, what you really need, is the freedom to exist without apology, the space to be seen, and the knowledge that you're worth protecting. And if the people who are supposed to teach you that refuse to do it, then you teach yourself. You become the parent you needed, you build the sanctuary you deserved, and you make absolutely certain that the next generation never has to choose between being loved and being safe. Because in a healthy family, in a real family, those things aren't supposed to be separate, they're supposed to be the same thing. And now Emma knew that. Knew it in her bones. Knew it in the library that had been stolen and reclaimed. Knew it in the house that was legally hers. Knew it in every day she spent with a mother who'd chosen her over everyone and everything else. And that knowledge, that certainty of being chosen, being protected, being worth fighting for, that was the real inheritance, the one that mattered more than books or houses or money. That was the legacy great-grandmother Helen had really left us. And it was the one thing my parents could never steal, no matter how hard they
tried.